Shalom Aleichem. I've heard now several times in the past couple days this sentiment that perhaps the difficult time that we are in is somehow related to the growing fracture in our nation, in Am Yisrael, in Israel, in these past several months. And I wanted to address this point, specifically speaking about the value of being unified as well as a practical vision for unity. I think that unity is something, achdut is a concept that everybody knows how to speak about. But very, very few people, if at all, seem to know how to put it into practice. Everyone knows how to speak about the value of achdut, right up until you hit the groups that don't fit in with your vision of unity. Here's my vision for unity. Here are the people who fit within it, but everyone else is outside of this vision, and I can't tolerate them within my vision, and that's where I think a lot of the problems start. Rav Nebenzahl points out on the pasuk of Ve'ahavta l'reacha kamocha, he asks the Ramban's question, which is, how is this even possible? Ve'ahavta l'reacha kamocha. How can the Torah require you not just to love one other person as much as yourself, if that's even possible, but to love every other person as much as yourself? That's downright impossible. How could the Torah possibly be demanding something of us which is simply against nature? Rav Nebenzahl suggests that perhaps we can explain this pasuk a little bit differently than is traditional. Rav Nebenzahl says perhaps the pasuk is not telling you to love your fellow as much as you love yourself, but rather in the way that you love yourself. So what does that mean? What that means is you're more than willing to love people until you reach the person you disagree with, or that you detest, or the person you simply cannot love. Then, all of a sudden, you have your reasons ready for why you cannot love this person, and why the mitzvah of Ve'ahavta l'reacha kamocha, it must not even apply to a person like this. Here is where the Torah comes in and gives you guidance. Ve'ahavta l'reacha kamocha. Are you perfect? No. Do you have flaws? Do you sometimes hurt people? Do you sometimes say things that you shouldn't? Do you sometimes do things that you shouldn't? Of course. Do you love yourself? Yeah. So you find a way to love yourself in spite of everything wrong with you. You find a way to love yourself in spite of all of your flaws. In spite of the fact that you too probably hurt people. In spite of the fact that you too probably do things that you shouldn't. You find a way to love yourself. So how are you supposed to love that person? In the same way you love yourself. By focusing on the good. By focusing on the good and reminding yourself that just like you justify your own flaws, you can justify other people's as well. Not as much as yourself, but in the way that you love yourself, in spite of the flaws. Rav Kook, I think, gives the best and clearest practical application of an actual functional vision of unity, both within Klal Yisrael, within Israel, and Bichlal. And he says, really, any functional, lasting, sturdy, stable society has the following three elements. Kedusha, something must be sacred in your society. If nothing is sacred, then there's nothing worth preserving. Humanism, there needs to be a focus on human development, individual development. There needs to be a culture. There needs to be an enlightenment. There needs to be a value structure and a morality of some sort. And nationalism. You need to have some sort of collective identity. It needs to be about more than just you in order for your society to last. And everyone knows that society needs these three things, and that's not really a point of friction. And it's also perfectly normal that specific people and specific groups of people will gravitate towards one of these values, one of these ideas, even perhaps at the expense of the other. And that's perfectly fine as well. So where do things start to go wrong? Well, things start to go wrong when you insist on viewing your world and all issues and all circumstances through one singular lens, the lens of your particular value, the value that you have the tendency towards. See, if you try to encourage people to go defend your borders through humanist values, you're going to have a very difficult time. It's nationalist values that are going to help encourage people towards that mission. If you're trying to pass something on to the next generation, but nothing is sacred, you're going to have a very, very difficult time to convey whatever it is that you think or that you value to the next generation if you treat nothing as sacred. These different aspects, ideas, and values, they are able to work together in order to create a sustainable society. You can have a tendency towards one, but you have to acknowledge the utility of each one, because what happens when you don't? You try to fix every problem and address every issue through the lens of a value that isn't suited to do that, right? And then, when it inevitably fails, the people who don't gravitate towards your particular value anyway say, look at the failures of that value. Look at the failures of humanism, right? The humanists, they're disgusting. They're terrible. They don't know how to maintain a society. Look what they're trying to do here, right? And you know, and with the failures of nationalism, the humanism say, look at those nationalists, right? Nothing is sacred to them, or they have no focus on the individual. They're trying to solve all their problems through nationalism, and it's not going to work. And they're terrible. And it's because not of the things that the values do well, right? But the things that those values in isolation do not do well that creates the rifts among us. Rav Kook says that basically within our camp now, within the Jewish community at large, there are three different groups that gravitate towards these three values. You have the liberal group that champions the humanist values. You have the Orthodox or religious group that champions the sacred values, and you have the nationalist group that of course champions the nationalist values. And that's perfectly fine, so long as each group recognizes the utility of the other and the necessity to look at their situation through multiple different lenses in order to create the best and most balanced response. But that's not what we do. We recede into our own groups. We fail to look at our issues with nuance and through multiple different perspectives. We look at it only through the perspective of our chief value. And when it inevitably results in failures, the other two groups see the failures as the result of our value and distance themselves from us, from the values that they would accept need to be in society, but they detest the way it's currently expressing itself in society. These values in isolation are not a recipe for a lasting society. And so, if they are tried, if people are attempting to only use these values in isolation, if different groups adopt different values in isolation, they are inevitably going to distance the other groups from them. And then you create three separate groups who don't know how to function because they have divorced their value from a broader system which is necessary for success. Says Rav Kook, in order to move forward and in order to succeed, here's what we need to do. Every individual, regardless of your tendency and your group's tendency, needs to acknowledge the utility of every value and needs to be able to learn from their positivities and even learn from the utility of the more difficult aspects of their value in order to craft a nuanced picture of the world that they're living in and solve problems appropriately and address the issues appropriately. Everyone needs to acknowledge the utility inherent within the other. Because if you divorce the conversation right now from this person, that group, and you just ask yourself, is this a necessary value? Of course you'd agree. But here's the thing that people don't want to do. In order to create that synthesized model, it requires shrinking yourself a little bit. You have to make room for the other. And that means that you cannot be singularly focused on one idea. You have to be able to shrink that idea in order to make room for at least the utility of the other two. Now, Rav Kook finishes and says, Chalila, nobody is suggesting illegitimate compromises or sacrifices in religion or in Avodat Hashem. Rather, a necessity to recognize how Avodat Hashem is multifaceted. How more than one value is necessary in order to properly serve HaKadosh Baruch Hu in this world.